Are you a fan of magic tricks? Well, did you know that Fabric SQL Database has a trick up its sleeve? We'll showcase this trick, demystify its secrets, and understand the Microsoft Fabric architecture for Azure SQL Database, all on today's chapter of Data Bard. Data Bard, 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 Data Bard. Dabba 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 dabba, hoi hoi hoi. Alright, here we are in our Fabric SQL Database environment. Let's set up the trick. I've got a SQL query connected into my Azure SQL Database, hosted in Microsoft Fabric, and I'd like to create a procedure. So type in a create procedure, and we'll put it in our DBO schema. So we'll just do dbo.spa, and we'll just give it a basic select one. Gonna make it a very simple procedure. Now to refresh, notice here in my store procedure area here, there is no store procedure named SPA in here. I can even refresh, and the query isn't there. The store procedure is not there. Alright, here we go. We'll create our procedure. Command completed successfully. We've created our procedure. Let's refresh to see our procedure. And like that, flourish. The procedure's not there, but our command completed successfully. What happened? Let's try it again. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna click on my database here, and we'll start up a new query. I'm going to take my procedure definition here, we'll copy it, and we'll paste it over here. And I'm going to change this to select 2. Let's see what happens. Command completed successfully. And with another magician's flourish, now our stored procedure is here. But that means we created the stored procedure twice. Both statements completed successfully, and yet we've only got one stored procedure defined. And if I open this procedure, you will see select 2, which is the second procedure that we defined. That first procedure disappeared into the ether. And just like that, voila! A missing stored procedure. Pretty cool, huh? Creating the same object twice in the same database, you are breaking the deterministic principles of database design.
This isn't just a
What
missing
foul
procedure.
sorcery is this? Whoa. Okay. Everybody chill out, alright? Just a trick, okay? But there's a secret behind everything, and unlike most magicians who won't reveal their secrets, I'll take a moment to reveal mine. Let's explain how this trick works, and more importantly, the architecture reasoning behind it. Alright, let's break down this magic trick into its components, and I'll show you how it works. So first, we created a stored procedure called SPA that returns select 1. I created a second procedure called SPA, which returns 2. And again, opening this definition, it shows 2. So how did I pull that off? Well, the secret is in the architecture of Microsoft Fabric. So let's explain this a little bit. Microsoft Fabric's SQL database implementation is an Azure SQL database implementation. If you were to create the Azure SQL database resource out in your Azure tenant, you would get the same type of resource that I'm showing here. The only difference is this lives within Fabric, or at least it lives in the UI of Fabric. But that's not the only thing that exists in these types of situations. Let's bring up the Fabric environment. Notice here, even though this is a Fabric SQL database environment, Like a lot of our other data storage solutions, lakehouses, warehouses, and the like, it gets the same experience. We've got our base SQL database item, and then we also have a SQL Analytics endpoint, which may seem a little odd that a database still has a SQL Analytics endpoint. Why? The secret is in OneLake. This top option is the Azure SQL database, but this doesn't actually live in OneLake. It lives in a typical Microsoft Azure architecture. This bottom option here, this does live in OneLake as a mirrored copy of your Azure SQL database. What does this mean? Well, it means that while they look like they're one in fact the same architecture, they are not. One is just the Azure SQL database, the other is a mirrored copy, and it is a separate object, which means two separate objects have two separate definitions. Let's go back to our environment. What I'm connected to here, with the name of the database and all this extra GUID numbers behind it, this is the Azure SQL DB itself. But like everything else in Fabric, I can connect to its SQL Analytics endpoint as well. So I will, instead of up here where it's connected to database.fabric.microsoft.com, same connection string other than it's going to be datawarehouse.fabric.microsoft.com. And if I expand databases, notice the difference in what we see. It looks like I'm seeing databard underscore SSMS Copilot Sandbox, that Azure SQL DB, in both locations. One, though, has this extra GUID-like value. The bottom one does not. That's because the bottom one is the SQL Analytics endpoint. And I can confirm that they're two separate objects by opening up the database, going into programmability, going into stored procedures, and here we can see both environments are showcasing this stored procedure, but the SQL Analytics endpoint is missing this procedure. And not only that, when I then take this definition of the procedure and I script it out as an alter statement, what do we find? We find the first procedure that we created, select 1. So that's the fun thing about working in Fabric SQL. When you're working in the architecture, there are actually technically two separate architectures of your SQL database. And in situations like this, where the stored procedure is just querying and returning data, you can define the same procedure with the same name in both locations, and they can have separate definitions because they're two separate architectures. So if you're working with views and stored procedures that are returning data, you can define it in both locations. What's the trade-off? Azure SQL DB typically is a standalone database. If you're wanting to connect that database into other databases, takes a little bit of extra work, polybase, external table definitions, linked servers, something like that. The SQL Analytics endpoint, however, is in OneLake, where Azure SQL DB, even the Fabric SQL DB, is not in OneLake. Because the SQL Analytics endpoint is in OneLake, you can do cross-database queries against your other SQL Analytics endpoints. So if I need to write a query that queries from my SQL database and also queries from my data warehouse, with the SQL Analytics endpoint, I can do that. With the base definition, that Azure SQL database implementation of Fabric SQL, I can't do cross-database queries, at least not in current state, because that lives outside of OneLake. And that's the secret of the Fabric SQL database. What looks like one architecture is in fact two. And you need to keep that in mind when utilizing this technology. And there we go. The magic trick is demystified, and in doing so, so is the Fabric SQL database architecture. If you check for a link in the description of this video, the link will go to the documentation by Microsoft that explains this architecture a little bit in more detail. A little bit of a weird architecture if you haven't been working with Fabric a whole lot, but I think it's going to be important for people to be familiar with this, as I'm assuming the same sort of consideration will come in with the with the Cosmos DB implementation that was announced recently. And if we get other offerings in Fabric similar to this, this pattern is likely to continue. That brings us to the end of today's video and the end of the magic, but that doesn't mean the conversation needs to end here. If this video is helpful and if you have additional questions, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ask away those questions about this architecture, other things on Fabric. If you like the UI experience and want to see more of what I'm doing with this database environment, check out the current SSMS Copilot Experiment series that I have going on right now. Some really interesting things in the vibe coding world, but more responsible vibe coding. We're not doing anything super shady here. But if there's any way that I can assist you in understanding Fabric, AI, agentic database development, or anything else like that to improve your efficiency as a developer, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to answer those questions in future videos. For now, I'm Data Bard, and I'll see you in the next chapter.